What do a collapsing communist empire and modern central banking have in common? For Roland Barthes, the answer was clear and deeply uncomfortable. Both represent central planning. One tried to plan production, prices, and resources. The other plans the price of money itself, interest rates, and controls the supply of the world's reserve currency. He made this argument in his most important book, published in 2010, just 2 years before his death, Geldsozialismus, Money Socialism. And in 2026, with $41 trillion in US debt, a Federal Reserve balance sheet that exploded from $800 billion to $8.9 trillion, and inflation that has quietly stolen more than 20% of the dollar's purchasing power since 2020. Barthes' warning doesn't sound like old theory anymore. It sounds like today's headlines. Today we begin working through this book. Geldsozialismus. Money Socialism was published in Germany in 2010. Barthes was already 70 years old. He had been writing about monetary economics for 3 decades, largely ignored by mainstream media, largely unknown outside libertarian and Austrian circles. But 2010 was a specific moment. The world had just lived through the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Lehman Brothers had collapsed in 2008. Governments had spent trillions on bailouts. The Federal Reserve had cut rates to zero. The European Central Bank was keeping the Eurozone alive with emergency liquidity. And every mainstream economist was telling the public the same story. Markets had failed. Deregulation had failed. Capitalism had failed. And only government intervention had saved us. Barthes wrote Geldsozialismus to tell a different story. Not the story of markets that failed, but the story of a monetary system that was designed to fail, that had been failing slowly for decades, and that had just produced its most visible failure so far, with the larger ones still to come. His central thesis fits in one sentence. We do not live in a market economy with a flawed central bank. We live in a money socialism with a market economy attached to it. Let that land for a moment. The distinction matters enormously. If the central bank is a flawed institution that occasionally makes mistakes, the solution is reform. Better models, better leadership, more transparency, different targets. But if the central bank is by its very nature a socialist planning institution, applying central planning to the most important price in any economy, the price of money, then reform is not the solution. The institution itself is the problem. Barthes argued the latter, and he spent 168 pages proving it. His argument rested on 3 pillars. First, money, in its original form, was a market good, discovered by the market, disciplined by the market, valued by the market. Second, the state systematically seized control of money over centuries through legal tender laws, central banking, and the abolition of the gold standard, replacing market money with state money. Third, state money, managed by a committee of unelected technocrats setting interest rates by political calculation rather than market signals, is socialism applied to the monetary system and produces exactly the pathologies that socialism always produces: misallocation, bubbles, crises, and the quiet but relentless destruction of ordinary people's savings. That is the thesis of Geldsozialismus, or money socialism. Now let's understand where it comes from. To really understand why Roland Barthes called our current system money socialism, we first have to ask a very basic question. What is money actually? Most textbooks give you a boring answer. Money evolved from barter. People traded wheat for tools, cows for cloth. But that was inefficient because you needed a double coincidence of wants. You had to find someone who had exactly what you wanted and wanted exactly what you had. So money solved that problem. But here's what almost every textbook conveniently leaves out. Nobody invented money. No king, no government, no committee sat down and designed it. Money emerged naturally through the market, through millions of people making voluntary exchanges over centuries. Think about it. In ancient Rome, soldiers were sometimes paid in salt. That's where the word salary comes from. In many cultures, seashells were used as money. In ancient Greece, cattle were money, which is why the word capital comes from caput, meaning head of cattle. And after thousands of years of trial and error, the market settled on two commodities that dominated almost everywhere: gold and silver. Why? Not because a government said so, because they were durable, divisible, portable, scarce, and universally accepted. This is Bader's crucial starting point. Real money is a market phenomenon. Its value is determined by supply and demand. Its quantity cannot be arbitrarily increased by a central authority. A gold miner has to work hard to find it and dig it out. That natural limitation protects its value. Now here's the big question Bader forces us to ask. What happens when a small group of people gains the power to create money out of nothing and control its price? That's exactly what we're going to look at next. Beginning in the 17th century and accelerating through the 19th and 20th centuries, states began systematically replacing market money with state money. The mechanism was always the same and always gradual. First, the state granted monopoly privileges to banks, allowing them to issue paper receipts that claimed to represent gold on deposit. Initially, these receipts were fully backed. One paper note, 1 ounce of gold. Second, fractional reserve banking emerged. Banks discovered they could issue more receipts than they had gold, because not everyone would demand their gold back at the same time. This was profitable for banks. It was the first step toward money creation from nothing. Third, central banks were created, officially to stabilize the financial system, to act as lenders of last resort, to prevent bank panics. In practice, to give governments a mechanism for financing spending beyond what taxation could support. Fourth, the gold standard was progressively abandoned. In the United States, the process took decades. FDR confiscated private gold holdings in 1933. Nixon ended the international convertibility of the dollar to gold entirely on August 15, 1971. Fourth, the gold standard was dismantled. The final break came on August 15, 1971, when President Nixon ended the dollar's last link to gold. From that day on, the world's reserve currency was no longer backed by gold, but by government decree and public confidence. The last formal limit on money creation was gone. Bader called what came after money by decree, fiat money, the most ambitious experiment in monetary socialism in human history. And like all socialist experiments, it promised to deliver more than markets could, and delivered less than it promised. To understand the Federal Reserve, you first have to understand what it really is. Not what its charter says, but what it actually does. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913. But according to its critics, the story begins 3 years earlier. In 1910, a small group of powerful bankers and U.S. Treasury officials met in complete secrecy on Jekyll Island, Georgia. No press, no public oversight. Just some of the most influential financial figures in America discussing the future of the nation's monetary system. Economist Murray Rothbard, whose work had a profound influence on Roland Bader, described this meeting in simple terms. It was a cartel organizing session. His argument was that America's largest banks were designing an institution that would protect them from the consequences of their own risky lending by creating a lender of last resort, one that could always provide liquidity when the system was under pressure. To the public, however, the Federal Reserve was presented very differently. It was marketed as a safeguard against financial crises, a way to prevent bank runs, a way to stabilize the economy and smooth out the business cycle. Botter completely rejected that narrative. In his view, a committee that determines the price of credit for an entire economy is not a stabilizing force. It is a price-fixing cartel backed by government authority. Why does that matter? Because the interest rate isn't just another number. It tells entrepreneurs how much real savings and capital are available. It tells consumers how expensive borrowing really is. And it tells investors which projects make economic sense and which do not. In a free market, interest rates emerge from millions of voluntary decisions made by savers and borrowers. But when those rates are set by a central committee instead of the market, Botter argued, they no longer reflect economic reality. They send false signals. Businesses believe capital is plentiful, even when it isn't. Botter pointed to periods such as 2001 to 2006, and later, the years following the 2008 financial crisis. Through his conclusion was simple. When the price of money is manipulated, the entire economy begins making decisions based on an illusion. Reality catches up. The Austrian business cycle theory, which we've explored extensively on this channel, has a name for these projects: malinvestments. They appear profitable during the boom. They attract capital, create jobs, and fuel optimism. But when the artificial credit expansion comes to an end, the illusion disappears. What once looked like sound investments are revealed as costly mistakes. Botter argued that this entire mechanism amounted to a form of economic central planning. Not because the Federal Reserve's intentions were socialist, but because, in his view, the method was fundamentally the same. Central banking fixes the price of money. In Botter's view, a central authority replaces the knowledge of millions of market participants. The result is always the same: short-term stability, medium-term distortions, long-term crisis. Through this lens, the 2008 financial crisis was not a failure of free markets, but of central planning. Years of artificially low interest rates inflated a housing bubble that, Botter argued, would never have reached such a scale under market-driven rates. And when it burst? The answer was more intervention, more money creation, and more manipulation of interest rates. Botter captured it in one sentence. They put out the fire with gasoline and called it a rescue. Was Roland Botter right in his argument? Is our monetary system really monetary socialism, or is he exaggerating? Botter states clearly, the problem is not just excessive inflation or occasional mistakes by central banks. The problem is structural. The entire system, compulsory money, the central bank monopoly, fiat currency, and interest rate committees, is nothing other than socialism applied to money. And like any form of socialism, it fails not because of poor leadership, but because it is logically impossible. No committee in the world can set the price of money correctly, for exactly the same reason that no committee has ever been able to set the prices of bread, cars, or housing correctly. The necessary information is too decentralized, too local, and too rapidly changing. In the next video, we'll dive deeper into monetary socialism, how this system works in practice, why it's virtually programmed to cause crises, and what consequences Botter predicted. What do you think? Was Botter right about monetary socialism, or do you see it differently? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next video.